Welcome back to Austin Peay State University. We are in chapter 11 today, but not the whole thing. Today we're going to talk about your final exam, your final project, which is writing a character analysis over the play Midsummer Night's Dream. So today we'll talk about what you should include in your paper and also a little bit about Shakespeare, who he was, and Midsummer Night's Dream. I always feel a need to start a Shakespeare lecture for just apologizing for the education system in general. What often happens is at an ungodly age, 7th grade, 8th grade, someone gets stuffed Shakespeare down their throat, usually in the way of having to read Shakespeare out loud as a middle schooler, which is very, very difficult. And so I always just feel a need to say, I know there's some baggage around Shakespeare, but if you give him a second chance, now that you're a little bit more mature, a little bit more fluid as a reader, I really think that you'll find that the poetry is very rewarding, especially if you take the time to invest in understanding it. You will need a copy of Midsummer Night's Dream, but it's available online for free. And I would recommend watching a movie version of it. Surprise, surprise. Shakespeare was meant to be performed. So feel free to listen to it, but you'll also need a copy with line numbers and act and scene breakdowns so that you can quote it for your paper. So, character analysis. This was invented by Konstantin Stanislavski, or at least he was the first person to write it down, which is like a formal way for actors to analyze the characters that they play. Who are you, as the caterpillar would say. So the first thing to say is that every actor will have a different interpretation just because of who they are. These are two different, very different versions of Puck from Midsummer Night's Dream. Puck, we know for sure, is a fairy. We know that he is mischievous, but whether that mischievousness is hateful or playful is up for interpretation. If you have Netflix, you may be watching the Midsummer Night's Dream from the BBC version. I think it was 1996. That character of Puck is he's just very spiteful and angry. and I tried to find a picture of him, but I didn't seem to find him. But he is a very menacing Puck. Other Pucks have been gymnasts and lighthearted and smiling and mischievously playing these tricks on people. You can see he's got his tongue sticking out there on the left. That's a much kinder Puck. So even though it's the same role, different actors will portray it differently. One of my favorite examples when I teach in a regular classroom is to show a clip from Denzel Washington portraying Fences, because he does it jokingly and laughingly. And then James Earl Jones playing the father in Fences is very serious and stern, and he yells a lot. And it has to do with what your interpretation of a father is if you're playing Troy Maxson. Someone Denzel Washington's age grew up with fathers that were more like friends, whereas James Earl Jones probably grew up with a father who was more authoritarian. So they probably bring out that side of a father. So both are fathers, and both are informed by the actor's psychology and what they already perceive a father to be. So I say that to say your character analysis that you write will be subjective. If I ask you to draw a dog, you'll probably draw a dog that you've had before, or one that you've spent a lot of time with, or maybe Snoopy, because that's your interpretation of a dog. And just like any other art form, theater and acting is open to interpretation. So, for my final project, I had to analyze Twelfth Night, Mariah and Twelfth Night, and it was about 100 pages. So don't be surprised when you find information online. If you kind of Google character analysis in Midsummer, there will be very in-depth ones. I want to challenge you not to borrow too heavily from any online source. First of all, that's plagiarism, but also I want you to do your portrayal of the character. How would you do Puck, for example, always ask yourself, what did the author intended? And when we get into the questions, you'll see that some of those kind of guide you towards author's intent. Like I said, it is subjective, so feel free to have your own take on it. So two things kind of really inform it: the script and then also the world of the play. You know, if you came to me and you said that you really feel like Midsummer, your character would be crying the whole play, I would kind of ask, is this a tragedy? And if it's not a tragedy, is your crying funny in any way? Right? The world of the play, what kind of atmosphere or mood is created, right? So, you want to base your interpretation primarily on Shakespeare's words, which means you're going to have to study. That's why I'm putting this lecture first, even though the paper isn't due until the last day of the semester, because I want you to start working now on really getting to know this script. So it's just a 2-page paper, minimum of 2 pages, 2 full pages. Please don't give me a page and a paragraph. At least 2 full pages, and that's double spaced, typed. So the first questions, I'm going to walk you through these questions. I've added a PDF there for you to look at and follow along these questions as you write. This does need to be the format that you go in. You need to go sequentially through these questions. Part of that is to discourage plagiarism. So the first question, oh, and another thing to say is, if the question has no answer, don't take the time to write, there's not a good answer to this in your script. Remember, you're trying to get 2 full pages. If you get halfway through the questionnaire and you fill the 2 pages, feel free to stop there. If one question interests you more than others, feel free to rely more heavily on that. But you feel free to skip questions. These are just kind of prompts, ways for you to get the conversation started. Number 1, what does my character say about him or herself? Right? And number 2, which is often more informative, what do other people say? Right? What is my self perspective, and then what are other people's perspective on my character? Right? What nicknames do other people give you? What observations do other characters say, and then what do I say about myself? Someone like Helena, there's going to be lots of information about what other people say about her, and I'm going to take the time to quote those or paraphrase those, right? Question number 3, what's my motivation? Now, if you sat through my acting lecture, you know that this is the question that actors ask themselves, what's my motivation? And for some of them, particularly Lysander and Demetrius, right, their motivation changes after they have potion put into their eye. I would ask maybe what's their motivation at the beginning of the play, or answer that by, saying that their motivation gets affected by this potions that Puck puts in their eyes. Most people, it's either money or love. That's usually the deep-seated motivations. And it can be a nuanced answer if you have certain motivations with certain characters, but I would overall, what is the driving force? What does your character learn throughout the play? How much do they grow? Disclaimer, not every character grows, especially in a lighthearted comedy like Midsummer Night's Dream. Right? But do they come to any kind of realization? Does anything change? I would argue for some of these characters that they do not change, but others do. This one is really thin. If you go into the realism period when Konstantin Stanislavski was writing, there were often, ginormous backstories. If you look like a character like Miss Julie by Strindberg, she talks about her mother committing suicide and her father's affairs, and it's very intricate. Perhaps the only characters we know their history would be, of course, the vocations of the tinkerers, and then, the Athenians. We know that they're pretty well off, the Duke. And Hermia, we find out a little bit about her father, but some of you will just have to kind of skip this one, or do some historical research. If you want to look up Athens and what was going on in Athens at that time, you may find that informative in your actor paper. But, it may include a little speculation. What do you think by the way that they talk, by the way that they carry themselves, what do you think their raising was like? What kind of, do you think they're well off? Do you think that they have a good relationship with their mother? And this is a pretty distinct question for different characters. And you could write, like I said, this kind of analysis can take hundreds of pages if you want it to. But you'll notice in everyday life you approach different people different ways. We are the faces we wear. Right? The way that I speak to my husband is different than the way that I would speak to you as a student, hopefully, right? And it depends on how well I know you, how much I trust you, what I need from you, right? The way that Helena complains to Hermia because she's her best friend, and then turns around and chases after Demetrius, right? She wants something from Demetrius that she doesn't want from Hermia. So just ask yourself, what is the dynamic between different characters? So just pick a few characters that your person relates to and how they treat them differently. One big question here is status. Who holds the power and who needs the power? And at what point in the play maybe does that power shift? So, and then the last question is just, some of you are very visual, and I would ask you to think, what does your character look like? You can include a picture from an actor who you maybe think could play the role well. What I would challenge you not to do is just Google it and put up a picture of the character that you've seen somewhere else. But this also, the pictures do not add to your page length, so please do not give me 1 page and 5 pictures. This is just sort of the icing on the cake. But you can take a moment to describe, the physical attributes that you imagine your character possesses. So, once again, there's many questions here. You don't have to answer every single question, especially if you don't think that the question is particularly pertinent or adds any insight to your character. I would ask that you go in chronological order through these questions. Feel free to include an introduction and a conclusion, but you can glaze over questions you think aren't relevant, but please, please, please put it into your own words. You may also use quotes from Shakespeare's work, Midsummer Night's Dream, with line and scene and page numbers, which we'll talk about in just a second, in order to prove to me what the author is telling you about this person. Not just that you've kind of made up this character, but what is the author's intent? What is the play telling me about this person? That you've spent enough time studying the script to understand and get into Shakespeare's head. Okay. I love Shakespeare. I love performing Shakespeare. I love the poetry of Shakespeare. I find it comforting. I find it wise. And so this is me at the Globe. I already told you I went to see Midsummer this past summer as I'm recording this lecture. A few things about Shakespeare. Many of you know he was born in 1564 and died in 1616. According to some records, he was born on the same day he died. That's pretty interesting. He was raised in Stratford-on-Avon, which is a small town. There's a good chance that his father was illiterate, and during his time, as they say on page 249, he wasn't really respected as an intellectual. He was respected as a profitable businessman. Remember, he owned part of the stock in his company, and so when the company made money, when the Globe made money, he made money. And so that's perhaps why he worked so hard, why he created so many plays, is because for the first time in theater history, people are starting to get paid for their excellence. And this happened in the Renaissance when Queen Elizabeth and then later King James really flourished and spent money on the arts, prioritized the arts, gave good attention to those patrons who supported the arts. So Shakespeare really was able to turn a profit, but he wasn't well respected until after his death, as is often the case. We don't really know a whole lot about William Shakespeare. We know that he was married to Anne Hathaway. We know that he had children. He had twins. One of them, Hamnet, died. Obviously, Hamlet is an homage to his dead son. We know that he moved back to Stratford-on-Avon after he was wealthy and wrote some of his final plays there at his home in Stratford. He wrote some good plays. I think Midsummer is one of the easier plays to understand. It's fun. It's hard to mess up if you go see a live version of it. The staging and everything is just so well written that it's hard for actors to not do the play well. He wrote some other plays that I don't think are good. Love's Labour's Lost, not a fan. Winter's Tale, can't get through it. But I love his sonnets, and he is by far, outside of the Bible, probably one of the most famous and well-known playwrights of all time. And one of the reasons actors love Shakespeare so much is because it's a way to show off. And he wrote that way on purpose so that these actors could show off their ability to handle language. And so when your junior high teacher hands you Shakespeare and asks you to read it out loud, it's really, really unfair, because it is the eloquence and the challenge of the poetry which makes it as fun as it is for actors. So, Shakespeare did not come up with his own storylines, which has sort of become controversial in our modern time, but almost all the playwrights of the time took other storylines and repurposed them. Hardly any of his storylines are 100% his own. Almost all of them were common legends, as we would maybe have different versions of Cinderella. You know, that was kind of the style of many of Shakespeare's plays. One of the biggest things about Shakespeare to understand is rhythm. Iambic pentameter, right? Shall I compare thee to a summer's day, right? That is a pentameter. It has 5 downbeats. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day, right? And an I am means unstressed, stressed. Now, the reason I have Topher Grace's picture up here is because of the clever thing that he did with his name, right? Christopher. The emphasis goes on the first syllable, Christopher, right? If I were to chart the downbeats, Chris-topher, right? Downbeat, unstressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, unstressed, Christopher, right? My name is Emily. Same thing. Now, when people give me a nickname, they almost always say M. When people give Christopher a nickname, they almost always say Chris, because it is the stressed syllable. The other two are unstressed. So most people don't call me right? Most people wouldn't call Chris Topher. And this has to do with the rhythm that Shakespeare writes in, right? Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. No shame but mine, I must forsooth be forced to give my hand opposed against my heart. Now that is iambic pentameter. That is poetry, as we would think of it in the classic way. Shakespeare's not the only playwright who wrote like this, but a way to understand his the beauty of the kind of writing that he did is to appreciate the rhythms and to say them in rhythm. Not as didactically as I just did, no shame but mine, I must forsooth, right? But to hear the rhythm of it. It's said to be the rhythm of a heartbeat, the rhythm of a canter if you're riding on horseback, a very organic language. And as an actor, sometimes that rhythm and the rhyming scheme actually helps you to memorize. It can be easier. So there's some speculation as to why he wrote that way. Now, not every line is poetry, right? So we can see here I've cut and pasted a section out of Midsummer Night's Dream. Now Quince and Snout and Bottom, the weaver, right? These guys are Shakespeare's minor characters who speak in prose. They're not wealthy. right? So the people who are lower class or comic characters speak in prose. There is no rhythm to the way that they're speaking. Call that blank verse. No rhyme, no rhythm. Or else one must come in with a bush of thorns and a lantern and say, he comes to disfigure, right? None of that Quince is saying is in any kind of rhythm. But now we get to Robin Goodfellow, or who we call Puck, right? And we come back into that iambic. What hempen homespun have we swaggered here, so near the cradle of the fairy queen? What a play toward... See, you hear that rhythm that Robin is speaking in at the bottom when prose switches to poetry, right? So Shakespeare would have written the lower classes to speak in prose, or something that's not as important, right? When people are discussing, what to have for lunch, they may not speak in poetry. But then when Hamlet steps to the edge of the stage and starts questioning his mortality, then he's going to switch into poetry. So that's something important to remember as you're writing about your character. Are they a person who speaks primarily in poetry or prose? Right? And you can see that switch. Another thing that helps you, if you look at the bottom of the page, see how everything in poetry is capitalized along the left-hand margin. So that helps you to know that it's poetry as well, and rather than prose. So listen for that when you're watching Midsummer Night's Dream, or reading along, as it were. So as you cite quotes from Shakespeare, I'm going to need you to give me the act, scene, and the line number. So just as the Bible is broken down by verses, or other great works, poetry, are broken down into verses, Shakespeare's he assigned an act and scene, right? And then also the line number. So make sure that when you get a translation, it has those in the margins there. Now this one says 31, 32, so on and so forth. Usually it's just 30, 35, 40. They usually only go by 5, so you may have to count down 3 lines and say, okay, this is line 37. But those line numbers will help me to cross-reference what you're talking about and the context in which you speak. So I am going to ask that no more than 10% of your paper be quotes. Just 10% of your paper be quotes. Please do not quote, because a certain percentage of what I need to read needs to be what you're interpreting. So your interpretation of the quote, not just, here's my evidence, you figure it out, right? So, but I would ask that when you do have a quote, just like you would an MLA cite the source, you would just put this in parentheses after the quote and a period after the parentheses closes. Hope you've seen that modeled before, or you see it as you look around the internet. I hope that makes sense. If you have any more questions about how to cite Midsummer, just let me know. And I will assume that if I see that scene act, right, the capital Roman numeral is act, the mini Roman numeral is scene, and then the line numbers are in regular numerality there that we're used to. So I will assume that if I see that you mean Midsummer and not another Shakespeare play. So Midsummer Night's Dream, disclaimer, is rated PG-13. Obviously the ass, I thought myself an ass, I am an ass, have it written down, I am an ass. That whole thing makes it PG-13, but also when people of that time would have heard Midsummer, that was a holiday, just like our Halloween, we expect ghouls and goblins and candy. Valentine's Day, we expect roses and candlelight and candy. I'm seeing a theme here. Almost all our holidays have candy in them. But for the summer solstice, for the midsummer celebration, it's a feasting day in the Catholic Church. They would have thought sex. They would have thought fertility. And so it's no coincidence that this Midsummer Night's Dream is an air of sexuality and fertility. There are jokes about sexually transmitted diseases. This play does have some, albeit, uh, often the sexual humor is sort of masked in wordplay, but bestiality here, right? She's sleeping with a donkey. Um, but it is a very sexual play if it is interpreted as Shakespeare intended for it to be. But they would have seen midsummer, summer solstice, and thought fertility, sexuality, a time for people to get pregnant. And of course, that also refers to the harvest and the full moon. So when Shakespeare creates this setting in ancient Athens, he picks names that are sort of, Helena, Hermia, ancient Grecian names, and part of the appeal of that in the Renaissance was this sort of renewed interest in classical Greek. They had found these libraries from ancient Greeks and Romans, and they were rediscovering texts like Plato and Aristotle's Poetics, and the French would take this to an extreme, and following Aristotle's advice about how to do plays, and we'll get into that next lecture. But Shakespeare is not interested in fully explaining history, as they say in page 248. He's not interested in giving a history lesson. So, for example, when he talks about the Duke and Duchess of ancient Athens, that is a Renaissance Duke and Duchess. That's not he goes about talking about the weaver and the tinkerer. We don't have a whole lot of evidence that these vocations were going on in ancient Greece. So it's sort of a melding of, Shakespeare often has the trick of setting it in some exotic, far-off land. Twelfth Night is set in Illyria. He's never been to Illyria. And there are all these references in the fairy kingdom to India, right? Shakespeare's never been to India, but he is in a port city where he's mixing and mingling with other people from other places. So, he's probably heard of these places. He's talked with people about them. But he's not interested in representing history exactly as it is. So when I have that word anachronism there, it means that he's going to have things that are anachronistic, that they don't exactly fit the period of ancient Greece. But this picture shows you, this is a Renaissance painting depicting the ancient Grecians. They were very much obsessed with that time period, and so this is sort of a nod to ancient Greece, but not something that is going to be to the letter or historically accurate, as it will be when we get to the turn of the century, and especially Duke of Saxe-Meiningen and those guys who were really interested in doing historical plays. So another kind of piece of history here. This is the Midsummer Night's Dream that I saw on the Globe this summer. These are the rude mechanicals. So to the far left there, the guy with the red socks, that's Bottom the Weaver, right? And he's the one who gets turned into a donkey. And then you can see Snout the Joiner. This is sort of a reference to the Middle Ages in the church when unions used to put on these plays. If you've ever heard of kind of like a judgment house, Hell's Mouth, where they would tell these stories, these biblical stories, these mystery plays. They would enact Noah's Ark, for example, and all of the shipbuilders would get together and put on Noah's Ark. So it was done by the different businesses, the unions, and in support of the church. And so those actors would have been the equivalent of kind of community actors. And so when Shakespeare writes this whole subplot with the rude mechanicals, with these this community theater acting group where these guys, work during the day, their day job, they're a weaver or a joiner or a bricklayer. Then they come together at night and they put on these plays for fun for the Duke and the Duchess. And the Duke will pay them for their efforts for putting on this little play, but they're not professional actors and actresses. So he's making a lot of jokes at their expense. They don't say their lines right, and they overact their parts, and so he's kind of making jabs at them. It's really a lot of fun. Play within a play kind of stuff. And it's not unusual. Of course, in Hamlet, he has little play within a play. He does it in many of his great works. I hope that you enjoy Midsummer Night's Dream as much as I do. I know that it's very similar to Alice in Wonderland. They're both fantasy worlds. One has fairies and the other one has talking caterpillars, but hey, I'm the teacher and I pick what I like. Midsummer is a beautiful story about love and about the kind of blurred lines between what is real and then what's not real. And it's just a very poetic play and very pleasant to hear. So I hope that you're not too intimidated by Shakespeare. I hope that you're able to find a character and fall in love with that character and get into that character's shoes and do some psychoanalyzing and get that on paper. As I said, that'll be due for your final exam to the Dropbox in D2L. As always, thank you for listening.